Hi, I'm Carol Baskin, and this is Cat Chat Show 51 with Gary Caskell. He is the author of the new book that's out called Monsters and Miracles, Henry Bergh's America. But there's a lot more to this man that I thought you might really enjoy. He was born and raised in Manhattan, where he studied the American Academy of Dramatic Arts as a teenager. He has been writing and making films since he was in grade school. His diverse career includes working as a camera salesman, stand-up comedian, journalist, technology consultant, charity executive, actor, screenwriter, director, cameraman, and editor. Since graduating from the Cal Arts Film School, where he studied screenwriting and directing under Alexander McKendrick, The Man in the White Suit, The Lady Killers, The Sweet Smell of Success, Gary has worked in film and television as a writer, producer, director, and cameraman for news, entertainment, and documentary projects. From 1980 to 1982, he was the associate producer for television legend Milton Berle's production company. After a move back to New York City, he became a freelance director-cameraman for broadcasters and advertising agencies, where he worked for a variety of programs including Entertainment Tonight, Inside Edition, and went on to co-produce and direct a one-hour documentary, A Museum of Broadcasting, Tribute Milton Berle, Mr. Television, for public television in 1984. With the rise of desktop computing in the 1980s and 90s, Caskell began consulting with broadcasters and publishers on computer-generated graphics. Man, that's come a long way. I'd love to talk to you more about that too. For more than 20 years, Gary Caskell has had a strong interest in animal protection and other social justice issues. He was the president of the United Action for Animals in New York City from 2003 to 2007. His intimate knowledge of the spectrum of animal advocacy led him to make Animal People, the Humane Movement in America, a feature documentary in 2006. From 2008 to 2011, he was a producer of the annual Genesis Award for the Hollywood office of the Humane Society of the United States, which was responsible for editing the clips and montage packages, as well as producing a variety of Los Angeles-based celebrity public service videos for HSUS. And everybody knows how much I love HSUS. Gary Caskell has also written for newspapers, magazines, the stage, television, and movies. He was a member of the International Photographers Local 644 for 7 years and is a member of the SAG-AFTRA and the Producers Guild of America. Presently, Gary Caskell is CEO of Carriage Trade Media, a production company focusing on developing socially conscious comedy, drama, and historical film and television projects. After several years of researching the life of ASPCA founder Henry Bergh, he wrote a historical novel based on his life entitled Monsters and Miracles. So tell us a little bit more about how you came to write this biography of Henry Bergh.
Well, I knew about Henry Bergh for a long time, and I always found him an interesting character. And as time grew on, I began to realize that he's not a well-known American, and I don't know why. He seemed to be the founder of two important social justice movements in this country, and yet he remains an obscure historical figure. So I began thinking about his story, and I was still living in New York, and actually I was living about 2 blocks from the ASPCA headquarters, and had friends over there who actually granted me almost unfettered access to their archives, which included Henry Bergh's personal journals.
Oh,
and
wow.
many of the clippings and scrapbooks that he personally kept and his people kept. So with that kind of treasure trove of information, you know, I got to kind of get a good background feeling of, you know, Bergh firsthand. And from there, I went on to continue research at the New York Public Library and other sources that for Bergh scattered around. And you know, I began to understand him as a man because, you know, a public image of a person doesn't reflect necessarily who the person is. You have to really dig into someone's head to understand who they are. And here's a guy that was born into a very wealthy family. He inherited millions in his 20s. He married traveled the world with his wife and kind of led an aimless life for the first 3 or 4 decades. And he was a writer of sorts. He was an unsuccessful poet and playwright, and he wrote a lot of plays about unrequited love, and it seemed like he was kind of this heart-sick man who was, looking for love in the world, even though he was married. In fact, he almost didn't get married because he was so, and I recount in the book that he was so frightened to go to the big wedding ceremony that his parents had planned that he chickened out, and they ended up eloping. And the parents, of course, still had 200 people at the church, so they had to save face. But Berg's an interesting character, and he really didn't come to his important work in life until midlife, until his 50s actually. And he was traveling through Europe, and he eventually became, through his friendship with William Seward, who was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State in the 1860s, he got a diplomatic commission to the court of St. Petersburg in Russia. And so he spent a couple of years in Russia, and the winters were very difficult, and his wife was very frail, and she had health issues. And after a certain amount of time, they decided that they'd had enough of Russia. So they decided to come back to America. But on their trip back, they stopped in Spain, and they were the guests of the King and Queen of Spain to a bullfight. And he'd never been to a bullfight before, and he was just appalled at the savagery of this really bloody spectacle. And it got him thinking. And through conversations, he discovered that there was an animal protection society organized in England called the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the RSPCA. So he decided to stop in London and talk to them. And he did that, and he spoke with the head of the organization and the Earl of Harrowby. And it kind of dawned on him at that time that, this model could be imported to America. And, in those days, the workhorse was prevalent in society. They were pulling streetcars, they were pulling carts and wagons, carriages, and in the heat of summer, these animals would drop dead from overwork. And the spectacle of a dead horse in the street was really a horrible thing. And in the dead of winter, they would be pulling streetcars that were overcrowded by double their capacity, and the animals suffered, really significantly and openly. But in those days, animals were considered property, chattel. And they still are chattel today under the law. But in those days, there was no protection for them, and people basically did anything they wanted. They would whip them savagely just to get them to move, and they didn't really treat them like sentient beings. For some of the bad players out there, I mean, people in those days were a little more primitive than they are today. And so, Berg was upset about this, and he decided to bring this RSPCA model to America. And he did that, and he was an influential New Yorker, so he got support. He actually spent his own money having dinner parties and lecturing on animal issues, and he got 50 signatures from prominent New Yorkers to get an ASPCA charter approved by the state legislature. The charter for the ASPCA gave them police powers, and the next thing he had to do was get the laws passed to enforce those laws. You had to have them in place. So he got the first animal cruelty laws passed in the state of New York very shortly after that. And so he set up office in Manhattan and started, he hired a dozen agents with peace officer status, and they had the power to go around and cite people who were beating their horses or overloading their carts or otherwise abusing their animals, and haul them into court. And some of them had to pay fines, some of them went to jail. But he wanted to start this movement to begin people thinking about the animal as more than just chattel. as sentient beings who needed to deserve the protection against cruelty. And this was controversial at the time. You know, there were a dozen newspapers in New York at the time, and about half of them lined up with him, and half of them lined up against him, because some of them, you know, had advertisers and corporate friends of the editors who were affected by this. Because, you know, you want to stop the streetcars from overloading people. That means you're going to have to load more streetcars, which is going to cost the company more money. So he was not afraid of challenging the status quo. And he was an imposing man. He was 6'2". He wore a stovepipe hat, and he was always dressed in this, you know, very formal overcoat with a ASPCA shield encrusted with diamonds and rubies. And he liked the sense of power that he now had over the public to go in and stop them from, you know, beating their horse or whatever they were doing wrong. And so he you know, became a public figure very quickly. The newspapers, you know, would satirize him with cartoons, and he ate it up. I mean, he used it. He was a very early, you know, user of public relations, so to speak, because the newspapers were the only source of information in those days. So he got a lot of press, and he became a New York figure of prominence with his new ASPCA. And, you know, this led to, you know, other jurisdictions, you know, after, you know, this took a while to catch on. I mean, he started in 1866 and did it through his death in 1888. So he was 22 years at the ASPCA, and, you know, after a few years, the animal protection movement started to travel to other cities, and other SPCAs were being formed in other cities after the notoriety that he received. So he really started this movement where Americans, for the first time, kind of regarded animals as sentient creatures deserving of treatment, you know, equal to people, or at least not being, you know, cruelly treated. And that was a big thing for the 1860s. It was really a dynamic change in the mindset of America.
One of the documentaries that made the biggest impact on me was Amazing Grace, which was about William Wilberforce.
Yes.
And he started the RSPCA, which you mentioned. I don't remember from that how far ahead of the ASPCA was the RSPCA formed.
Well, the RSPCA was founded in 1820.
So this was 20 years later?
In the early 20s, yeah. Well, 40 years. It already existed for almost 40 years when the ASPCA was founded.
Wow.
Wilberforce was, I don't believe he was a founding member, but he was a member. The founding member was Richard Martin, and the other name escapes me. But Wilberforce was an MP, a member of Parliament, and of course he was also credited for pushing through the anti-slavery legislation that abolished slavery in England, you know, 40 years also before America did the same thing.
Wow.
So England's always been ahead of us in the protection of people and animals, and they probably still are today. The RSPCA is, you know, the animal cruelty laws in England, I think, are stronger than they are here, or at least they're enforced. It seems like they're enforced more than they are here, but it's a mindset that we imported successfully thanks to Henry Bergh.
They are. The UK is so far ahead of the US when it comes to wild animal protection. I can imagine that with domestic animals it's because of the fact that they're so far ahead of us and have been doing this so much longer. But I found it fascinating that it seems like everybody knows Wilberforce's story and nobody's heard of Henry Bergh. And so it was startling to me to read that here's this person that is responsible for starting this in America, and you're right, nobody's ever heard of him.
Right. Well, you know, Wilberforce wasn't really a very well-known character until they made a movie about him. So hopefully we'll get a movie made out of the book, and people will know who Henry Bergh is. So we're working on that here in California. I'm working on it now.
Wow. Well, if anybody can do it, I would think it would be you.
Well, it's a tough road, but Henry Bergh's character is a great, it's a great part for a mature actor, and I think the movie would be a fabulous learning tool and a story to tell. And Henry Berg also remains an enigmatic character on a number of levels, but one of his achievements that's also not known is that let's see, 8 years after forming the ASPCA, he became the plaintiff in the first lawsuit to assert the rights of children against parental abuse.
Wow.
Because in those days, parents could basically raise their children any way they saw fit, and nobody could challenge them. And a church worker who knew of Berg's reputation came to him because she was aware of a little girl that was being, really beaten and mistreated by her mother, who was an alcoholic, and that she went to the police and they wouldn't do anything, and she went to her alderman and they wouldn't do anything, and went to the district attorney's office in Manhattan and they wouldn't do anything. So she finally went to Henry Berg saying, look, can't you do anything for this little girl? I mean, can't you invoke the animal protection laws? This girl, isn't the little girl a little animal? And he said, ultimately he did take on the case and became the plaintiff or the ad litem representative of the girl. He didn't invoke the animal cruelty laws, but he did get the mother arrested for assault and battery, and she went to jail. And following that, he founded the first Children's Protection Society, and that led to child labor reforms and everything else that came along with the children's protection movement. So he's really responsible for two major social justice movements in this country.
I think most animal people would just, or maybe most people in general, would just be so surprised to hear that the protection of children came out of the protection of animals. You just would have assumed that human issues would always have been the leading driver, and this obviously was not the case.
Yeah, you'd think it would be the other way around, but no, that's historically the way it happened.
Even people who don't care much about animal issues, you would think, would find this story about Henry Berg to be very compelling and would want to find out more about him.
Yeah, well, he has, the stories about him are legendary. He was very confrontational. And it's an interesting profile because up to then he'd never really been very confrontational at all in his career. But, he challenged big names like P.T. Barnum and Commodore Vanderbilt, who owned the bus lines, the horse-drawn buses. And he went up against big corporate abusers in the day when, that wasn't, that was a new thing. And he prevailed. I mean, he was really very aggressive in his protection of animals. And there's stories in the book of him, stopping a worker from erecting a wall where there was a cat trapped inside, a domestic cat, and some woman in the neighborhood found out about it and brought him over and said, you can't build that wall with a cat inside. That's ridiculous. And the worker was just didn't really care. And Berg made him tear down the wall. He said, if you don't tear down the wall, you're going to go to jail.
I wonder if this was any inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's book.
It could be, but Berg was not afraid of confronting animal cruelty perpetrators, and he did so very publicly. And he had a couple thousand prosecutions in his 22 years as president of the ASPCA.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like to deal with people at that point in time who had never even entertained the idea that animals should be protected, and now they're being told that they can't abuse them or beat them. And I know here, all these years later, animal exploiters are some really scary people, and they are threatening and violent, and obviously anybody who's cruel to an animal will be cruel to a person. But then, I mean, that just had to have been scales of magnitude worse to walk into, like you had a reading on your site about him walking into a slaughter plant, and I thought that was really a very brave moment in the life of this man who had not been exposed to that kind of violence before.
Right. Well, the common misconception about animal cruelty in the minds of the public is that the majority of it is perpetrated by individuals like neglectful pet owners. But the reality is, and even back then, the reality is that main the main amount of the most animals in abuse are perpetrated by corporate abusers and institutional abusers. You know, factory farms and slaughterhouses and pharmaceutical testing and vivisectors. Even in those days, they were starting to do vivisection. The medical community was starting to, was trying to vivisect live animals. And Berg went up against all of them. And this is many of the issues that Berg attacked 150 years ago. We're still working on today. There's still issues today that need to be abused. Factory farms, pack in hundreds of thousands of animals in tiny little cramped spaces, and medical colleges are still using live animals for teaching purposes. There's still bullfights in certain jurisdictions, Spain. There's still immense cruelty overseas. I mean, China is a nightmare. They still, they're still raising fur animals, and some of them are skinning them alive.
I've seen those videos.
I know, it's shocking. I mean, it's shocking that people can be so completely violent and cruel to living creatures with no remorse, and yet, it's still going on. And it's an education process, Well, first you have to pass the laws to protect them. A lot of countries don't have any animal protection laws. I don't know about China, but we're working on it. But Henry Berg, was influential in getting these laws passed in the state of New York, and from there they propagated all over the rest of the country one by one, because people realized it was the right thing to do. And it always takes some leader to raise consciousness and start a movement. And it started with one person in this country. And it just is a tribute to the fact that, social justice really begins with one person. And that can lead to other issues, other movements, and it should be inspirational. I mean, his story really should be taught in every high school in America.
Oh, I agree. I can't believe that we don't know about him. I find it amazing that, as much as I feel like I'm tied into the animal protection community, I had never even heard his name until I heard about your book.
Well, that's why it's important that we have people like you that have shows that spread the word through, the media, and that's how the word gets out. And the more people who learn it, they tell their friends, and they'll tell their friends, and it just spreads in a pyramid.
Will you be introducing this book as an audiobook by any chance?
Yeah, I haven't done it yet, but I know it can be done, and I'm going to talk to the publisher about that.
That's about the only way I ever get a chance to read anything, is when I'm riding my bike back and forth to work.
Yeah, a lot of people do that in the car. I know it's popular. I'm going to talk to the publisher about that.
Here you said that he didn't even have any pets and wasn't particularly fond of children either. What do you think was his motivation to change the status quo?
Well, he's written a lot about that, and if you read his own words, his motivation really came from the fact that it wasn't the act of cruelty that offended him as much as it was the unfairness of it, that it was the helpless that were being exploited by other people that offended him, and that the lack of mercy in human beings was wrong morally and ethically, and that it would take another force to stop it. And he really went all out in almost every forum to both enlighten people, teach them, and then punish them if they wouldn't stop. And he wrote a lot about mercy and about the unfairness, the inequity of one group exploiting another group and treating them badly. And I think he was offended at that. So he he was an interesting person. You know, he kind of has a dual personality. You know, he almost had a contempt for people, and he never had any pets, and he never had any children. Although he didn't, you know, he didn't have any particularly ill feelings personally about having them, but it just never happened in his life. But he would say really terrible things about the kind of punishment that people abuse animals and children should endure. He was satirized once for making a speech in which he said that he would, if necessary, he would invent a steam-powered flogging machine that would just flog somebody who was cruel to animals in public to teach them a lesson until their skin turned black. And the newspapers picked up on that and actually created this really bizarre cartoon of a steam-powered flogging machine with Henry Berg, you know, over the pulling the switch of some poor soul being flogged, you know, with this mechanical thing. And he just had no patience for bad people, for bad actors. He would just want them punished in the most severe way possible to teach them a lesson they'd never forget.
What do you think is his legacy that he's left from all of this effort that he put into raising awareness and changing the way we treat these animals?
Well, he has a tremendous legacy in this country, not only by changing the mindset of a nation and getting laws passed that had not existed before, but he started a movement that propagated itself across the country and then to Canada and other foreign countries. Even though England had preceded him, England didn't really have any influence on other countries following their path until Berg really made it a big issue. And, you know, many of the issues that Berg attacked in the 1800s, you know, we're still dealing with today. And so his legacy is just tremendous because he started two movements of social justice over sentient creatures, animals and children, that had not existed before, and it was the time was right, I guess. After the Civil War, we'd just gone through this horrible war, and tens of thousands of Americans had died, and you know, the savagery that people inflict on each other really is not the same as the savagery that we inflict on animals and lesser creatures in those days, because, you know, the children and animals can't fight back. They can't speak for themselves, and they can't fight back. And so someone had to come and protect them. And Berg really was responsible for that. That's an amazing legacy.
I would think that this is something that would resonate with so many people, because regardless of the issue involved, I think we all have a sense of what's fair and what's not. And it sounds like from what you're saying that was really a driving factor for him, is that this was just a very unfair way that we're treating animals. And so by exposing that, people who care about being fair or who care about being treated unfairly would benefit from this, I would think.
Well, he made a statement of, you know, mercy for animals means mercy for mankind. That, you know, we elevate ourselves when we elevate our treatment of other beings. And it was really about fairness and equality and compassion.
I'm curious, from the perspective of an author, you're a storyteller, you're
Right.
diving through all of these handwritten journals and all of the information that you're able to dig up about this person. How does this story unfold in your head?
Well, I am basically a storyteller. I'm a filmmaker by profession. And so when I read stories of people and their histories, you know, I don't see it as a dry history. I try to tell it in a narrative way that people can relate to. And I try to get inside the head of the people I write about. in Berg's case, you know, he was a very rich subject because there was so much written about him publicly, and there was his own writings that I had access to. And, you know, I called it a biographical novel because it's not really a dry biography. It's a story that I've used some cases of dramatizing things, getting inside of his head. Obviously, his public statements are a public record, but what people of historical figures say in private, you know, obviously we have to summarize and dramatize what they would have said, what we believe they would have said, and be authentic about it. So I think I've kind of tried to show Henry Berg as a three-dimensional figure. He wasn't a perfect man. He had a bad temper. He was fearful of certain things. He was, you know, actually a man of contradictions in many ways. And so you have to kind of get inside that head and say, well, why would a man who never had to work a day in his life put everything on the line to start this nonprofit organization and really kind of go up against some of his friends and, you know, influential New Yorkers who were business people? And why would he do that? And you have to kind of sift through both his public statements and his private writings to kind of form a full three-dimensional picture of the man. And I hope I did that in this book. I think I did in a way that is satisfying to tell as a story. Now, I tell this story. This book is actually narrated by the little girl that he saved from the parental abuse.
Oh, how interesting.
So she's the narrator of the story 50 years later.
Wow.
More than 50 years later. She's 70 years later. She's 80. She's 80 years old. Well, so more than 80 years. She's 80, and she was 9, so it was 71 years later. So she's the narrator of the story to explain why she really owes her life to Henry Berg. And then she goes back and recounts, you know, Berg's story that led up to the nexus of their meeting, thanks to this church worker that brought her abuse to Henry Berg's attention. So I like to tell it as a story because people can, you know, relate to people more than they can to events. People recounting events, you know, is what storytelling's all about.
Wow, that is really a clever approach. Really clever. Is this your first book, or have you written other books?
This is my first book. I've written for television and the screen, but this is the first novel that I've written. And actually I'm working on sort of a semi-autobiographical novel based on 1 year of my life. And the year I turned 30, from 29 to 30, was a very unusual year for me. And so I'm writing, that's my next story. The title is I Could Have Been a Pawnbroker.
No, that's an interesting title.
my father, we had a family business. My father was a pawnbroker in New York. And I didn't want to go into the family business. I wanted to be a writer and a filmmaker. So that was, you know, what could have been my path had I not chosen this.
Well, that's a very challenging path because, I mean, if you consider the huge impact that video and documentaries have made on our lives, and so many people want to be involved in that kind of a field, that there's just tremendous competition there. And yet you've managed to really be involved in some major, especially the animal protection movement, working with HSUS and the Genesis Awards and those sorts of things. How did your path take you there? What were you doing that started?
Interesting question. I was asked that some years ago. How did I get interested in animal protection issues? And I didn't get involved until I was in my late 30s. And I had to think hard about it. Yeah, how did I get involved in this? And I kind of realized that it really was thanks to the media that I got involved in this, because I was living in New York City in the 1980s, and there was a very strong public access cable television channel there that a lot of people watched, and there was a program on about the animal cruelty issues by a group that no longer exists called Trans Species Limited, I think was the name of their group. And they would talk about animal protection issues, but they would show very graphic footage of animal cruelty perpetrated by the government, by pharmaceutical testing, by the various perpetrators of animal cruelty. And they would show footage that the television networks wouldn't show and still won't show. And those are the things people need to see, even though it may be offensive to some. In my opinion, if you don't see these things, Wayne Pacelli from the Humane Society has a great expression. He says, "Don't avert your gaze to animal cruelty." You can't turn away and say, "I don't want to see this because it's too painful." You have to see it, because if you don't see it, then you won't stop your consumer choices that are leading to this or driving these things. And so that program, that cable television access, public access program, got me angry looking at these things. We're talking about the Navy blowtorching live pigs with flamethrowers, to test, burn victims, because when they really want to test anything, they're not going to test it on a person. So they think it's okay to do that to an animal. Mm-hmm. And monkeys being wired up, and cats being wired up with cigarette smoke to test cigarette. I mean, we already know that cigarettes cause cancer. Even today, they're still testing cigarettes on animals, live animals. Well, why? We know what cigarettes do to human beings. We don't need to test these things. It's just completely unnecessary. And so I started going to these. They had meetings in a church basement on the west side in Manhattan, and I started going to these, and they would be illuminating in some ways. But inevitably, these meetings always kind of got to a point where people started arguing about strategy. And so they would break out into these, huge fights about what we should be doing, and people were yelling back and forth. And to me, that particular group wasn't that productive. So I stopped going there, but I eventually became involved in another group that was trying to improve the shelters in New York, the animal shelters in New York City. Then from there, I started an ad hoc committee, and that was overseeing the transition from the ASPCA, which ran the shelters for 100 years, and then gave it up under increasing public criticism for killing animals in 1997. It's interesting. I'll go back a little bit, because the ASPCA is an interesting organization, but the minute Henry Bergh died, the board of the directors, became populated by Wall Street financial type people, society people, and I don't think their interests were at heart lined up with Henry Bergh necessarily. So they weren't as dynamic, and they didn't challenge the status quo as much as Bergh. Bergh was offered by the city to run the animal shelters in his life, and he declined. He said, "I'm not going to kill animals. I don't want to run the city shelter." And less than 20 years after his death, they accepted the contract in 1896. So they ran that. The ASPCA ran the animal shelter, public shelters for New York City for 100 years. In the 90s, they became under increasing public scrutiny and criticism for really not following the mandate of protecting animals when you're killing stray animals that they couldn't home. And so they dropped the contract, and the city took over the job with a bunch of health department bureaucrats populating this not-for-profit corporation that was founded. So I began an organization, kind of a committee, that oversaw that transition, called the Shelter Reform Action Committee, which still exists. They have an online presence at shelterreform.org for New York City. And from there, through a relationship with the president of United Action for Animals, who was retiring, asked me if I was interested in running the organization. At that time, I was freelancing as a director cameraman, shooting video and film for advertising agencies and news and different clients in New York. And I found that that might be a more satisfying career path, because I was really more interested in animal protection issues than I was filming commercials. So So I did that for 5 years. I ran United Action for Animals in Manhattan for 5 years, and we had a spay neuter program, and we did a lot of oversight, and it was a great experience. After 5 years, I was offered a job from the Humane Society of the United States through my media. I produced the documentary Animal People while I was at United Action for Animals. And Animal People is an overview of the various players in the animal protection world. The animal protection world has a wide spectrum of philosophies going all the way from the left to the right. And, the left kind of being animal rights, people who believe that animals should have the same legal rights as people. And then, more to the right would be animal welfare people who think that animals aren't really equal to people, but we shouldn't treat them cruelly. And we should protect them from various treatments. And so the different groups of animal protection, animal welfare, animal rights people don't tend to mesh very well. They all have their own kind of philosophies. So there are different groups that have sprung out with different philosophies. Animal People, the documentary, kind of was an overview of those different personalities and players, and a certain amount of history going back into the formation of how these groups came about, starting even before Henry Berg, but Berg started it in America. So the Animal People documentary led to the Humane Society asking me to work on the Genesis Awards out here in California, which I did for 4 years, and that was rewarding and an interesting experience. So my knowledge of the animal protection issues became very, very intense over the last decade because I was exposed to so much of these issues in my work. And I have a good understanding of what these issues are and who the players are. And I think that helped me tremendously in evaluating Henry Berg's life and telling his story about how he challenged these various people. And there's a lot of pushback when you challenge people that are making money exploiting animals. You get a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
I mean, there are groups out there, there are groups out there that are shell groups formed by big pharma, fast food industry, in all the industries that exploit animals, and they try and dispel and put out misinformation about what they do and what they're being criticized for doing, and the groups that are criticizing them they put out misinformation about. So it can be a really nasty fight when you're trying to stop animal cruelty when people are exploiting animals and making a lot of money at it. And ultimately, if you want to know about any issue, follow the money.
Yes, and you're right. The bad guys are so much better funded that they are able to pull off some smoke and mirrors type deceptions on the public because they can make it look so credible. And
right.
The typical person on the street doesn't know where to go for their information. If it sounds like a legitimate organization and it looks like a legitimate organization, then and they're seeing that kind of dogma printed everywhere, then it's very difficult for them to research things back far enough to find out what the truth is. So you're right, it is a matter of following the money. You would think that would just be common sense, that if the organizations that are making so much money off of factory farming or circuses or those kinds of things, of course they have a reason to be trying to dismiss any kind of criticism on what they're doing. But I still hear people that I think are well-intended and they love animals, but they will come to me and say that they've heard something. Typically the HSUS, I think, is the 900-pound gorilla in the room. If they're not behind something, then it's probably not going to happen. And so we absolutely adore them and really appreciate every bit of help that they've given us on different issues, such as the Captive Wildlife Safety Act and the Big Cats and Public Protection Safety Act. But I'll hear somebody say, oh, well, this organization said something bad about HSUS, and it's like, well, of course they did, because they're threatened by HSUS being in there exposing them for what they're doing.
Right. Well, there's this bogus lobbying group called the Center for Consumer Freedom.
Doesn't
Uh,
that sound important too?
it sounds completely deceptive, and it's in fact it's run by a fella named Berman, whose own son has disowned him. If you read on the internet for being
Wow.
such, for being such a creep, and they do nothing but put out misinformation about particularly HSUS and other animal groups that are effective, and they're funded by the tobacco industry, the big factory farming and fast food industries, and all the people who benefit. And the reason that they're there is because groups like the HSUS are effective, and they're scared. These groups, these people that they're attacking, are scared because we are making it. I mean, I was brought in California, started working for HSUS the year that Proposition 2 in California was a ballot initiative to stop heinous factory farming practices, and it passed by the widest margin of any ballot initiative in the state of California. Two-thirds to one-third it passed. So it indicates, and the interesting breakdown was that it passed in equal amounts in rural farming areas as it did in urban areas in California, which really indicates that there is a growing mindset that animals deserve to be treated, without cruelty, by a wide margin of people, a wide spectrum of people, no matter where they live, no matter what they do for a living, and that's very encouraging. There's still a lot of work to be done because there's still a lot of problems, but I think that the task that Henry Berg has left to his future generations is really to get people to consider their consumer choices and what those choices drive in the products that you consume. In the 1970s, we had a movement driven by a fella in New York to stop animal testing for cosmetics, where they would, routinely destroy the eyes of hundreds and thousands of rabbits just to test these products. And he got them to stop. Henry Spira, great American. And he is an example of one of the disciples of Henry Berg. I mean, he understood that the way to get things done is to get in the public eye, get in the public view these issues. And he was very good at that. And he shamed Revlon and Avon and these other companies into stopping this by public demonstrations in New York that were on television, and people just went nuts. And when you see these things on television, people just go nuts. Anytime there's an animal mistreated that's reported on the news, the switchboards light up. Yeah. That's the only way making these things aware to the public is the only way they're going to change. Because, sunshine is the greatest disinfectant. I think Oliver Wendell Holmes, Chief Justice, said that. It was true in the law, and it's true in animal protection, that if people don't know about it, they can't see it, then they're not going to be concerned with it.
I think that's one of the scariest things that I'm seeing state by state are these ag-gag bills, where
Yes.
industry is trying to prevent anybody from getting the photos and the videos that would expose them for what they're doing. And I'm blown away that those kinds of bills manage to pass. And I've got to think it's only because people don't know. The public has no appetite for getting involved in politics, and yet if they don't, the animals suffer.
Yeah, well, they're outrageous, and they've passed in a few states, but they've also been shot down in a bunch of states too.
Yes.
I think the more attention that's given to them before their passage, the less likely they are to pass, because they're basically unconstitutional. I don't know whether they've been challenged in any states that they have passed in, but they recently were not passed in a couple of different. I think it passed in Iowa, but it didn't pass in Colorado. But the ag-gag, which you should explain to the listeners, is laws that are making criminal acts out of taking undercover video or recordings on factory farm or farming institutions. And obviously, if the public can't see these acts of cruelty, then they can continue, without being penalized. So they're mostly passing, obviously, in farm states. But there's, it's a sinister. I consider that the height of sinister, misuse of legislation, because it's, I'm sure they're going to be constitutionally challenged in the states that they did pass. But the fact that they even exist is kind of like a throwback climate, in this country. This country has a lot of political problems, obviously, based on recent, activity from the Tea Party and other people that are not concerned. The libertarians are concerned with laws that affect them. But without laws to protect children, to protect animals, we would be free to do anything we want. We'd be going back in time. So I don't buy into that whole argument at all. I think that we have to have animal protection laws. We have to have regulatory laws, and we have to have, ones that make sense, obviously, not oppressive ones, but ones that make sense. The Humane Society of the United States, their biggest critics are animal breeders, people who breed particularly dogs. And these people go nuts when you try and pass any legislation saying, hey, you have to have certain standards to breed animals. If you're going to breed animals, at least do it in a way that's humane. And they just go nuts when you try and regulate animal breeding, and it's wrong. I mean, the fact that we're even breeding animals for sale when there are thousands and millions of them being destroyed in shelters across the country is already obscene. But again, it's always about the money. People are breeding for the money, and people are breeding, to keep the lineage pure, quote unquote. And we've heard that kind of language in the past, and it's it's a problem. Changing. I think Gretchen Weiler, who was a great animal advocate and Broadway star, had a wonderful expression. She said, "It's more important to change minds than laws." We wouldn't have to change laws if we could change people's minds first, and it's difficult.
It is, and I think, over the years I've tried. I started from the other direction because I felt like, well, if people understood the plight of big cats and what was happening with them, then they would rally behind better treatment toward them, or even the people who were raising them would treat them better if they knew better. And I didn't find that to be the case. You could,
Right.
The first thing that I ever wrote in this genre was about how to take care of exotic cats, and people didn't want to do the things necessary to give them the proper veterinary care and the proper food and the proper housing and that sort of thing. And so what we found was that legislation was the fastest means to an end that forced them to do the things that they should have been doing just because it was the right thing to do. So I think even though it's probably much more important to change minds than laws, changing laws fixes the problem a lot faster.
Absolutely. Oh, well, I worked with Tippi Hedren, who has Shambhala out here with big cats at the Shambhala Preserve. And she was one of the authors of the captive wildlife protection law that was passed in 93 or
it actually
2003.
It was launched, I think, in the 90s, but it wasn't until 2003, after 3 sessions, I believe, it finally passed. But right. What happened that year was, up until then, the number of big cats we had to turn away every year was doubling every other year. And in 2003, we had to turn away over 300 big cats. And after that law passed, which was in December of 2003, the very next year, instead of having to turn away 500 or 600 big cats, because that's the projection that we were on, because of the fact that the breeders saw that this thing was coming down the pike, they didn't breed the cats that then would be discarded the following year.
Yeah.
And the next year, we only had to turn away like 160 big cats. But as 9 more states have passed bans or partial bans, that number has dropped every year. So we know that changing the laws is what it's going to take to be able to protect wild animals in captivity, or maybe from captivity would be a better way of saying that.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we all are aware of the recent activity with marine life, with the movie The Cove 2 years ago, and then Blackfish this past year has raised consciousness about theme parks like SeaWorld and other people that have captive big marine life, And it's a shocking thing that people don't get it, even when they're told, that they still attend these parks and think that it's a reasonable thing to put a sonic creature in a cement enclosure and make him do tricks. And people, they think it's good for their children, that their children should be entertained and informed by these shows. But I think these two motion pictures have helped to really raise consciousness tremendously. And hopefully, these practices will eventually die off as people stop attending these parks. So, it's going to take a while, but there's big money behind these parks, and they're putting out disinformation in the same rate. And so it's the same story all over again. And Henry Berg was challenging P.T. Barnum for having a live menagerie in Lower Broadway in Manhattan. They had 2 whales that died because they didn't bring in salt water. They put them in fresh water. They were so stupid in those days. And then they brought 2 more whales in, captured them in. They put them in salt water, and then they died anyway because the water was coming from the Hudson River, and it was just And then the structure was made out of wood, so it had burned down twice, with live animals inside. And it's just incredible, the stupidity that people perpetrate on animals on the behalf of quote unquote education and entertainment, but ultimately it's making money for themselves.
If you were to envision Henry Berg today, alive and well today, and having learned what you've learned about the way he was thinking and the things he got involved in, what do you think would be his next order of business right now?
Oh boy, that's a great question. He would have to look at the bigger picture across the country. Of course, he only worked in New York in his lifetime, New York State in his lifetime. I think he would want to branch out into countries like China and India and third world countries, because the third world countries is where there is just immense animal cruelty being perpetrated and no laws to protect them. And I think he would kind of strategize for the bigger picture and say, let's identify where all this animal cruelty is taking place, and let's go there and attack it. And because there are probably 1,500 animal protection organizations in this country, big and small, and overseas much less, much fewer. Every country has a couple, but not like the U.S. The U.S. has many, many more. And China is a big epicenter of animal cruelty, exploiting animals and for fur. And as with big cats, they use body parts and they use the teeth for the most ridiculous Chinese medicine, aphrodisiacs, cures for arthritis, all this, and none of it works. It's all nonsense. It's all it's all ineffective. And it's this quote unquote ancient Chinese medicine is the source of a lot of animal cruelty and death, because they're harvesting animals for all these parts. Shark fins, they'll cut the fin off the shark and they'll throw the live shark back in the water without its fin to spiral down to the bottom and basically drown, because they want to make shark fin soup, which comprises of a tasteless piece of shark fin that they flavor with pork or beef or some other flavor. It doesn't even mean anything. And it's just outrageous that, I think in terms of animal cruelty, the Chinese have to be the worst players right now. Japanese also share some of that responsibility. And as you know, or may have read, the International Whaling Commission last week finally put a ban on the Japanese whalers capturing whales that they said was for research purposes, but we all know it wasn't. They were just harvesting them for whale meat. And so we do, it takes a long time to make progress on these issues, but it requires dedicated people to just keep going, just keep fighting the fight. If it takes years, it takes years, but it has to, somebody has to do it. You just can't stop, because there'll be somebody coming in to fill the vacuum to exploit animals once they're allowed to.
I think this thing with the whaling was it was groundbreaking. And yet, when I look at it, I can't help but wonder, because I'm not in that community, but I can't help but wonder if a huge part of that isn't the public embracing whale wars, that it's a matter of a television show inspiring people to become active
Right.
and to get involved, and that we need a lot more programming like that
Yeah.
um, that makes heroes of the people who are protecting wild animals instead of heroes of people that are out there harassing and exploiting them.
Right. Well, Whale Wars was the #1 rated show on Animal Planet for 3 years in a row,
Mm.
and Paul Watson, the captain of the ship, has been doing it for 25 years. So it took him that long to get that kind of media attention. And once again, it's through the media that we expose these issues to so many people, and that's what drives change. Is that you can't drive change, and if you don't know about it.
Well, tell me what gets you out of bed every morning. What do you hope to
My cat,
accomplish with this book? Your cat?
I've always been driven to be creative, and I'm never bored. I always have something on my plate. Being creative can manifest itself in lots of different ways. My activism, I like to merge my activism for animal protection and my creativity when possible, because that's doubly rewarding. And it's it's tough sometimes, because some people don't want to really get involved in that, and they think that, well, my philosophy about persuasion has always been, you can't beat them over the head with an issue. You have to bring people into an issue in a non-threatening way, so that they can come to the conclusion that you come to on their own. You can't tell them, this is the way it should be and this is the way you should be thinking. You have to expose people to the problems in a sympathetic way, so that they arrive at that conclusion on their own. Now, it may take a little more time, but it's the only really effective way to persuade people about how to change the way they think. And it comes down to almost everything in life. I mean, from the choices we make for clothing, for food. Vegetarianism and veganism is a hot topic right now. But a lot of people get angry if you say, "Oh, you're trying to make me a vegan. I like my meat." And I say, "Well, fine. You know what? You can't say, no, you shouldn't be eating meat because look at those animals, the way they're treated." That doesn't work. But show them the way animals are treated. There was an old expression: if slaughterhouses were made of glass, there'd be a lot more vegetarians in the world.
Sure.
And so, if you expose people to what their consumer choices are driving, and they see what their choices are all about, then you have a much better chance of them changing their choices. And that's really the way the world changes. It doesn't change with one person beating another person over the head about why their philosophy is superior. It doesn't work that way. The art of persuasion is about getting people to arrive at conclusions on their own, through their own experience and through their own, cogitative process. So it's that's my philosophy, is that I try to show people, I don't try to editorialize strongly. I try to kind of subversively editorialize in the background, and let people kind of see, oh yeah, okay, now I get it. That's what you need to really do to get people to change, so that they feel that they're part of the movement, they're part of the change, and that it's a rewarding feeling.
I think that is such excellent advice, and really pertinent to somebody like me, because I'm very results oriented, and I just have the hardest time beating around the bush to get to the point. And so it's a good reminder that you need to start where people are and give them that opportunity to be eased into a different way of thinking, because there's no way that we're going to hammer that into their heads and make them believe it.
Right, right. And there's the different groups have different philosophies. Like obviously the Humane Society of the United States and PETA, work completely different ways in terms of getting a message out. PETA is very theatrical. They're very in your face. Sometimes I think that's counterproductive. Sometimes it turns people off. They're very good with young people because, obviously the future of the world is with young people. Whereas the Humane Society of the United States focuses on legislation and education, and it's the spectrum of groups all work in their own way, but put them all together, and hopefully you get the message out, and things change. So everybody has their own way of doing things.
Well, I think that is a wonderful way to wrap this up, and we're in the last minute or so of the...
Oh my, that was fast.
Isn't it though? Is there something that you would like for people to know about you that we haven't covered yet?
Something about me?
Yes.
Well, no, this isn't, I don't know, it's not really about me. I'm obsessed with Henry Berg. I mean, all I want to do is get people to know that this book is a rewarding read, and you will not only enjoy reading it, but you will learn a lot about the history of the animal protection movement and why these issues are important to continue talking about today. And that Henry Berg started something that we haven't finished yet, but hopefully his work will have a legacy that will go into the rest of the history of America, I hope.
I'm going to put a link in the show notes, but for those who are just listening by audio, do you want to tell them where the best place to get a hold of a copy of your book is?
Well, it's for sale on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com and the publisher, and you can actually find links for them on my website. Just go to GaryKaskel.com, and that's GaryKaskel.com, and it'll give you some information about the book, and you can read a chapter of it, an excerpt from it, and you can go to the links to buy it online. Or if there's still a bookshop in your neighborhood, you might find it in there. But the bookstores are they're one by one, they're closing, but it's available online, so you can get it right away. But it's a great read, and I think it's good for almost all ages, and it's hopefully will be enlightening in a very positive way.
I am sure it will be, and thank you so much for being with me today, Gary.
Carol, I appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll see everybody next week. This has been the Cat Chat Show. You can find us at catchatshow.com. You can also find us in iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Talk to you next week. Bye.